Greg sent me 2 articles, and I guess you guys have those as well. So I have basically reviewed them. Like, I didn't create a formal review that I could send you, though I could do that if that'd be really useful. But I essentially did the work that I always do for a paper I'm reviewing just prior to writing things up. So I kind of commented it out for myself to get a sense of where, you know, in theory, this author could improve. So we can certainly talk through some of those. I was just saying before I came in that those 2 papers, I mean, every paper has flaws, that's the nature of this kind of endeavor, but their strengths and weaknesses were very different from each other. So I think they'll be good examples to kind of talk through how different kinds of papers need different kinds of feedback. So I guess, I'm trying to think of sort of the best way to start. I mean, one thing I might say to contextualize any of the comments I'm going to make here is that, you know, I work in the side of social sciences that's pretty science-y, which is to say that, you know, almost all the papers I write and read and review are papers that, you know, present like a formal method section for a study or studies and results section with statistics in them and things like that. So certainly of the 2 papers I read, one of those looks a lot more like the kind of thing I'm used to reviewing than the other, and we can talk about whether that other one should have looked more like that. But when it comes to maybe some of the social sciences that edge a little bit more towards humanities, I'm going to be less useful. So if you take a paper that's kind of, you know, philosophy maybe, or I don't know if that's which one that's considered, but or even certain kinds of like anthropology, or, you know, fields where you're maybe not sort of setting out like, here's the method, here's the results, here's a discussion section. I just have much less experience reviewing papers like that, so I can't be quite as helpful, but I'll do my best. I guess, can I start by asking you, I mean, are there questions, like, are there things that when you think, okay, we're going to have to be dealing with picking social science papers, you know, that you're particularly unsure about, particularly confused about, questions that are at the front of your minds? Yeah.
So I'm used to reading papers and like examining the validity of the evidence, but that's more towards like really, really hard science.
Yeah, bench science kind of stuff, right?
So how would you recommend that we approach like social science in terms of like scientific papers?
So to me, those of you who are in, you know, psychology is really science, but, you know, like that kind of science fields, you know, again, really sort of like hard sciences, physical sciences. I think that what you're used to thinking about is exactly the right way to think about the kinds of papers I'm talking about, at least. So if you're reading, you know, an empirical psychology paper, a paper that, or any social science paper that really lays out the methods of a study and the results of that study, you know, in the background that led to the hypotheses, that kind of thing, all the same kinds of questions you're going to want to ask yourself about a biomedical paper or a physics paper. It's all the same kind of stuff, you know. Was the justification for designing and running this study reasonable? You know, is it something that's novel, if it should be novel, if it's explicitly, and this is something we'll talk about maybe with one of these 2 papers, but something that's really meant to be replicating and extending some other work, you know, are they clear about what the added benefit is of doing that? You know, do they provide sort of a sensible, logical set of background material in terms of, you know, where the idea came from? I mean, that's all kind of the same as with any other kind of science. And then, you know, do the methods make sense? Now, of course, you know, you'll have varied expertise as to what good methods look like, but to some extent, you know, your scientific intuitions about good method, good measurements, you know, tight experimental control, that kind of thing, that all has analogs in social sciences, just as it does in bench science. You know, do the results seem reasonable? Are they presented in a clear way? I'm going to make some assumptions about the journal and say that, you know, it's going to be a broad audience probably reading, right? So you wouldn't want something where only someone in that field could ever understand it. And so, you know, even if you're outside the area, you should at least be able to have a sense of what the heck they found. And so if they're not clear about that, that's a problem. And, you know, are they reasonably, therefore, interpreting in the discussion section their findings that they hopefully clearly conveyed in the results? I mean, that's all the same kind of stuff you would be looking for in papers you're reading, I'm sure. So I would say that those instincts are going to be good and solid and applicable to this kind of stuff too. Again, when you get into something where it's more a field where the ideas are meant to just kind of come out of the author's mind, and there's really not meant to be kind of a grounding in data or theory, then I'm also a little bit out of my element. You know, I've certainly reviewed papers a little bit like that when I was on the faculty editorial board of the student journal here. And it was always hard. I was like, where's the science? I don't know what I'm doing. So yeah, my instincts were not going to be great there either. And frankly, if you've had, I don't know, I was described as the next speaker, so maybe you guys have either heard from or will hear from someone who's more on the humanities side of things. Probably many of you are in that land as well. Their advice will be better for some of those, I don't know, softer, you might say, social sciences. Yeah, that's a long way around to saying all the same stuff you're used to doing. I think it's the same, basically. Yeah. Other questions that I can kind of begin with? All right. What would be most useful? Should we go through maybe the papers that I read? Yeah? Okay. Let's do that. So let's start with, hang on, which number is it? Nope, the other one. 33? Is this how it's in your minds?
The one on ADHD?
Yes, the one on ADHD. Correct. Okay, so okay, let me sort of give my overall summary of at least how I would kind of, my conclusions, I guess, about this paper, and then we can go through some of the things that caught my attention. My read of this, and this is near to my world, I don't study any of these topics specifically, but it's very social psychology-ish. My read of this is that there's a lot of potential here. It's not reached yet in its current form, and I had some questions about kind of the clarity, some clarity issues, I guess, in terms of why they were asking some of the questions they were asking and the order in which they presented things like that. But ultimately, it's a decent study. I mean, it's, I think, fairly clear to me that this is a study that was being run by the person's advisor. So it's a good study, probably grant funded, and the analyses are reasonable and the questions are reasonable. So it's overall a fairly solid paper by my read. The one really, I think, fundamental question I had about it was, I sort of alluded to this a second ago, but it strikes me that based on the background this person provided, that it may not be a particularly novel question or set of findings. So it sounds like most of what this person tested analytically is stuff that we kind of already know, the field, whatever this field already knows. And so that's okay, especially with student submissions. It's not, I wouldn't expect students to be reinventing the wheel, probably not a good idea if you are, but, or inventing a new wheel, I guess is a better analogy there. But as I kind of said a second ago, one of the things that we are talking a lot about in my own field right now is that replication is good. I mean, you want to, see if things that maybe were found in one random study one time actually happen again. Like if we can, use a different sample at a different time with maybe slightly different methods or very different methods, if the same question gets the same answer. I mean, it's a really important function of science. And so, to the extent that that's really what's happening here, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I didn't feel like the author of this paper did a very good job of articulating what is new, what is more of kind of a replication, again, is the word we always use, replication of previous work. And to the extent that maybe most or all of it is essentially retesting questions that have been tested in other places, why is it necessary to do it again? What maybe wasn't done as well in those old studies that have been improved in this work? And so that's the thing that for me, if I was in your position looking at this paper, that would potentially cause me to say maybe it hasn't reached the level of the, I'm sure, very limited space that you guys have, basically. But in terms of the rigor scientifically, it's pretty good. So does anyone have any comments or questions about that before I get into the nitty-gritty?
Kind of springboarding off what you're saying.
Yeah.
I noticed it, and probably as a result, I may have missed some stuff down further in the text.
Mm-hmm.
But I noticed that its initial kind of statement was to attempt to address an absence of literature on this particular demographic.
Yeah.
Does it kind of contradict itself?
Yeah, a little. It felt like to me. And you feel this a little bit in the introduction. I mean, you always want to say, like, here is the background literature that makes me come up with this hypothesis, but here it sort of felt like, we know this is true, so we're going to test if it's true in this data set. And then you feel that in the discussion a little bit too, like, yep, this finding is consistent with this other stuff that, I haven't read those papers, but they sure make it sound like, I'll say they because I don't know, guy or girl, but, whether it's new or not. And again, that's why I say that it's really important when you're working on something that's really close to a lot of other work that exists to be very, very clear. Like, we know this, but we don't know this, or we know this, but the studies that showed it, we're only looking at this age group, or only looked at it in men. And so just to get a little bit more specific with this paper, one of the things that was sort of striking to me is that my very not expert knowledge about ADHD is that it's far more prevalent in male youth, at least diagnostically, like more men or boys are diagnosed with ADHD than women by a lot. And so it's sort of unusual to be focused exclusively on females when it comes to a study of ADHD. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It could be a really good thing, actually. But is sure unusual. So that may be the demographic novelty that the person was talking about. Trouble is, again, it's just not articulated very well. Like if the study had, sort of been set out as like, we know these things in males, and which is not clear to me whether that's true or not, but we know these things in males, we don't know anything about females, let's see if these patterns essentially replicate.
Right.
Great. But yeah, again, it just wasn't super clear, and if you're only studying one gender group, you can't make comparisons, and so then it's like, well, are we really learning anything new? So yeah, I think there was just, again, lack of clarity was a big problem for me with this paper, and so you're wondering how new, and my being not at all sure it's new is a problem. Like, we should know the answer to that reading it. Yeah, agreed. Other, I guess, initial reactions if you read it? Were people, I don't know how many of you actually read it, I know you're supposed to, or if some of you were supposed to. If you read it, I mean, were people generally positively disposed towards it? Or, was your reaction like, this is a solid thing? I gather from what little I heard, this one kind of got middling reviews. Is that about right?
Probably, yeah. To me, at first, at least on my initial scan through it, I was kind of impressed that this was actually like, its framework and outline was actually well done, which has kind of been a problem with a lot of the other pieces that we've reviewed. In fact, we kind of got a running tally, and so far it's been 0 for 4.
Oof, yeah.
So,
right.
So this was like the first thing, like, holy shit, this is actually competently done.
Right. That was my kind of feeling too. I mean, like the heading structure isn't perfect APK style or whatever, but it kind of like it's organized, like reasonably organized. Yeah.
There is a little bit of like weird sort of like parenthetical hygiene, I guess.
Yeah.
Like there was like putting like ADHD in parentheses and then like a line of citations and then like some weird kind of stuff, and it's just not like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. But at least there's a definite structure. Yeah. And it's done competently. Yeah,
so
I'll give it that
much. APA style. Yeah, agreed. And again, I think that the study itself, like the methods, are good, although I mean, this is not something you probably should be evaluating. My sense is that I'm sure that the method, it's been going on since 1988 or whatever, or 1998, so like, clearly this is not the student's original project. That's totally normal, that's not a problem. It's just, I don't know how much credit the student gets for the study design, because that's clearly something that the advisor did. Okay, yeah, so I probably had I been, reviewing this paper for a journal in my field, let's say, or in a relevant field, it wouldn't get accepted in its current form. I think, in our parlance in journals that I review for, I might give it what we call a revise resubmit decision. In other words, like, there's something here, I think it's workable, you could probably improve this enough to make sense, to make it something good, but it's not there yet. Let me just scan down with my comments and see. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it ended up coming down to lack of clarity. So or lack of clarity and just like argument organization, kind of. So like, again, it wasn't really clear to me at any point in the paper why we should be particularly interested in looking at females, although the word female appears a lot. But like, why conceptually that was an important thing, it was not so clear. I can certainly imagine why one might want to look at females when it comes to things like being the victim of intimate partner violence. But again, ADHD is it's more male typical, and so sort of the gender piece of it I didn't feel like was elaborated very well. It wasn't very clear to me. Like, why in the world ADHD is of interest in the context of victimization, I thought was not entirely clear either. It's clear there's other studies on that, maybe a lot of them, but I thought the sort of argument for why ADHD is particularly a risk factor for victimization was sort of like, it's not even intuitive to me, much less clear in the paper. That's kind of the basis of the whole study, so it would have been nice to get a little more than just like, others have found there's a thing here. I would like to kind of know, what is it about ADHD that we would imagine might make people more likely to be victimized. And again, there's like threads here and there where the author sort of addresses that, but just not super clearly. I shouldn't have been trying to figure that out on my own. Let's see. Sorry to make you guys watch me look through this, but I just want to make sure I catch the important things. A lot of this is, a lot of what I've said so far is kind of about the setup of the study. Again, the design I thought was reasonable. It was explained to me quite clearly, perhaps because I'm used to reading papers like this, but generally speaking, the measures were described in a thorough way. That's important. The analyses were generally reasonable. I could nitpick the analyses, but that's not of interest probably to the broader group. There's a few things that they did that were sort of not optimal, but generally speaking, fairly reasonable. Yeah, I would say that really a lot of my evaluation of this came down to like, is this new, and if so, how, and if not, why did you do it? And help me understand what the logic is for your hypotheses. That's to me really where the problems came. And so that's why I say that there's potential, because if in fact there is a really good explanation for those things that could be provided clearly, then I think that the findings could be interesting and the method is reasonable. It's just until you know why something's interesting, it's hard to evaluate whether it's interesting enough. So that's kind of my evaluation of this paper. Again, other thoughts, questions? General, I have 3 probably responses here. I might just be arbitrarily picking that number, but something around the range of 3. One is the definition of a study or original work when it comes to data sets that are really hard to collect or that take place over a long period of time can mean like a piece of that. So, there are researchers who spend their entire career, like developmental psychology, this is really common, where you can't be alive long enough sometimes to collect a 30-year data set. And so you spend maybe your whole career looking at big data sets that someone else collected or a big group of people collected, and you're just taking pieces of it that are relevant to your research questions. And so we will often say, in this study, meaning like this subsection of the data being analyzed in a particular way. So in terms of it being, it's original work as long as those analyses essentially have not been done before. It doesn't really matter who designed or collected the data, because that's just it's a field level difference where sometimes that's just a necessity. In terms of whether the student had permission, I think you're probably going to have to just take people's word for that, because that'll always be a concern to some degree if you're dealing with data. But again, I really feel like the fact that question comes up in one's mind is a fault of the author for not being really clear about like what else has been done with this data set, what other sorts of related findings are out there, and again, we're like situating the question and the analyses really solidly within the context of what's already been done with that data set and other related data sets. So I think had that been clearer, had the student said, as you really want to do when you're dealing with kind of an existing data set, we published on this, this, and this, but this question's unanswered. If the student had done that, then you wouldn't even be wondering about this, I think, because it would sort of make clear, like, the PI has done these other things, the student is doing this. And this, students of mine do this all the time. I have a lot of big data sets, and so students, like capstone project is very often some piece of a data set that I wasn't going to do anything with, and so great, they can, benefit from that. Yeah. So that's kind of a lot of stuff, but does that kind of get at your question? Did it get at all the pieces of your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Other thoughts about this one?
I just felt like this wasn't written by a student. That's the only thing that was of
That's
great
interesting.
concern, because when I was reading through it, and my initial thought was, great, this is great scientific, things that can be repeated and done
Mm-hmm.
again. But at the same time, I wouldn't say this was done by, I would say an undergraduate level at least.
Yeah.
There is
No way.
definitely, I noticed that there was a lot of very heavily scientific language and sort of, I would say, vernacular tenses, that sort of thing, sort of diction. That's the word I was looking for.
Well, so I guess one important question then, and you just want to make sure you're conveying this really clearly to your submitters, is to what extent are they allowed to have an advisor or mentor edit? Because I think like before a capstone project goes in, I've touched it. If my student has written it, I'm editing a little bit, not heavily. I'm not rewriting, but I'm clarifying terminology, making sure the language flows clearly, and so you probably want that. You're going to get a lot better submissions if there's a degree of editing allowed. Certainly, you don't want to see plagiarism. It's probably wise to run all these things through some kind of safe assign or something.
I would definitely run this by at least the IRB or the PI, because.
You mean if you were the students?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If the student had submitted, well, I'm guessing this is the student's. Okay. I would have definitely run by the IRB.
Well, so the IRB would come into play way back. So the analyzing data that already exists, the IRB doesn't actually have to get involved. So assuming that the PI has these data collected, it wouldn't be an IRB issue. But yeah, I would sure hope that the person whose data these are would have seen this paper before it got submitted. I think it's a reasonable assumption, and I would say, to me at least, just having seen a lot of student work over the years, the level of writing feels exactly like the kind of thing that a student definitely wrote and that an advisor helped clean up a little, but not perfectly. It's not as clean as you'd see from a faculty member writing. Yeah, but good to wonder. It's just, I think all you can really do at that point is run it through a plagiarism checker and just make sure they're not like literally copying previous work, yeah. Yeah, that'd be my suggestion there. Yeah.
I would disagree because I've read also a lot of like student scientific papers, and this is pretty much like on point with what they would do. But I feel like there was so much jargon that like it was really hard
That's
to
a
get
different
through.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and again, I don't know a ton about Audeamus. Am I even coming close? Yeah, close enough. I saw it was like in phonetic on the webpage, but yeah. So presuming that you guys want like everything that's in there to be at least reasonably readable by a general audience, then that's a different kind of feedback. So that's not sort of about whose work is this really, and more about really emphasizing that if people are submitting scientific work to this journal, that it needs to be at a level that a non-expert could read. Yeah, and again, for me, this was comfy because it's not like my work, but it's close enough. But that's a tricky job I think you guys have, because to have a journal that has potentially something like this, or even something that's in the sort of even more like physical sciences, and poetry, it's going to be tricky to get those both accessible to the same audience. So I think that's a tough charge that you guys have to make that work. But certainly I think it's always better to have less jargon, frankly. Like jargon is never really helpful. I think that one of the things that happens, at least in the social sciences, is that we have a lot of jargon. I don't know if it makes us feel like sciencey or something, but very often, so maybe it's reasonable for the author to want to make sure they're using terminology that's consistent with their field. So like intimate partner violence is probably not the kind of thing you're talking about, but let's say that phrase intimate partner violence, it's the phrase, that's the term everyone in that field uses. And so it's reasonable that the student would use that term, but never should jargon be used without some layman term clarifying parenthetical the first time it's used, essentially. So yeah, I think in this case it was a little heavy on the jargon. Again, like the statistics and stuff like that, I don't know what you do about that. They need to explain that in an appropriately complex way. And so that's, again, it's just a tricky job you guys have to make sure that you're getting good science explained clearly, but also in a way that's accessible. Yeah, this paper probably didn't do that as well as it could have.
Yeah. I was just thinking that like maybe like at least like the introduction / like
yes.
abstract, and then the
Absolutely.
discussion should be clear, and then the methods with the data, like that doesn't have to be as accessible, because this is like really hard. Like people spend their lives doing this, so it's
exactly
going to be complex.
No, I think that's very reasonable, and especially with a topic like this, which is not rocket science, so to speak. Like people should be able to relate to and understand like what ADHD is, what intimate partner violence is, what peer victimization is, and so yeah, I think this was less accessible than the topic should have allowed it to be, and that would be good feedback for the student. Other thoughts on this one? Okay, let's turn to the other one. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what to do with the other one. So here's the trouble. This is closer to the kind of paper I'm used to seeing when I randomly and very rarely wander into something like the undergrad research journal, where I'm reading things that are more humanities-ish. It's not humanities exactly, that's not quite right, but not empirical work, meaning not like data collected. And yet there were data collected, so it's kind of it's a weird paper. Like I wasn't sure quite what to do with this one. What were your initial thoughts about this one? This is the piracy one, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Yeah.
When I was reading it, like the whole entire time, I was just like, because like I think one of the pie charts they used only had like 36 subjects.
Right.
So it was really like bad.
All
like,
of them, yeah.
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 I don't know. I didn't think it was very reliable.
Nope.
And it was kind of like.
The entire thing was amateur hour.
Okay. Yeah, that was my reaction too. Amateur hour. That's a good. Yeah, and like good effort, smart kid, I'm sure. But yeah, it was not top-notch work. Other thoughts before I tear into it? Yeah.
I'm not in the sciences, so they clearly conducted that poll themselves.
Yeah, like with their friends, I think.
Is that
basically.
okay? Or
No.
is that okay?
Well, I mean, not if you want to conclude anything from it, right? So here's what I'd say about that aspect of the paper. I mean, one, it was not, well, yeah, it was not great science by any stretch. Terrible science, really. But, the kind of thing that a small poll can be good for is getting things like one of the things this person was trying to do, which is, having people kind of tell you why they might be engaging in piracy, for example. And so, maybe you don't need 1,000 people to find out, to get a vague sense of some of the reasons why some people might be engaging in this behavior. However, that's not really all this person did. This author essentially tried to draw some pretty strong conclusions about like half the people are doing this, and 2/3 of the people are doing this, which just makes absolutely no sense when you, what pretty clearly sounds like gave a survey to your friends. And it also made me feel like this person's interested in piracy. Probably this person's friends are like not entirely representative of every person ever who uses the internet or streams digital content. So. Yeah, no, I mean, it's bad science. And again, there's certain ways in which you could write a paper in which you would just sort of use, open-ended responses, meaning, you just sort of ask people questions and let them say some stuff to you as like illustrative examples of something you're trying to say. But yeah, in terms of making any kind of claims about how often things are happening, not acceptable. Agreed. I have other thoughts about this one, but before I direct the conversation too strongly, yeah.
Just reading the abstract and the background, the introduction and investigation, that alone, without the bad science, was bad enough.
Yep. That's really my other thought.
Hard
Yeah.
enough to follow, difficult to follow because it was I have some cited source, but I don't explain it at all.
Mm-hmm.
I just threw it in there.
And on top of that, it literally sounds like the abstract and the introductory paragraph are the same.
Yeah.
Which is one of many abysmal things that this thing did.
Yeah.
But
so here's one I would have to say that you'd want to definitely run through a plagiarism checker. And the reason why I say that is not plagiarism broadly defined. I'm pretty sure this is basically a book report of a How Stuff Works article, which it cites, sort of, but like every 2 sentences. And also, by the way, there's a copyright violation problem in that this person pulled figures from a How Stuff Works article without, you have to gain copyright permission. You can't just take it and have the little thing on the side. So that's not good. Several times this happens. But the amount of times that there's some name that was clearly the author from howstuffworks.com, I won't have to look far to find it because it's every other sentence. Let's see. Oh yeah, Carmack. So Carmack is somebody from How Stuff Works, I think, and clearly basically wrote this article. I mean, I think it's basically just a summary of the How Stuff Works article plus a little survey tagged on. And again, I'm inferring that because all of the figures come from the How Stuff Works website, and that person's name is just all the way through. So you could, I think it's cited what that article is. So I mean, again, it doesn't sound like anyone would be particularly predisposed to having this in the journal, but you could, let's see, is it? Yep, there it is. So you could just go to the How BitTorrent Works, How Stuff Works article and then poke around and see if I'm right about that. But a significant part of this article is clearly not the students' ideas, which is a problem in the sense that there's no strong science here, obviously, as we just discussed. And so the only merit then of the article is potentially the student providing a unique perspective on digital piracy. But that unique bit, I think, is absent from even the part well before the survey. So yeah, this is a troubling submission, I would say. If that was your reaction, it was mine as well. And I was trying hard to be like, right, it's not the kind of thing I'm used to seeing, but I just think, yeah, it doesn't do any one of the things that you would sort of want to see something, a submission do. Yeah.
Do you think maybe if they had taken it more in a humanities direction and done like personal interviews instead of a survey,
Yeah,
that might
I
have
think
worked
that
better?
could have been a really interesting piece. I mean, the topic is potentially really interesting. So yeah, providing the whole chunk that, again, from my perspective, I think is all from that other article. Crunch that down as just quick background, essentially, and then yes. So a sort of methodological take that gains new information that's more maybe qualitative is the word I would use for that. So not a survey, but asking people really to give their kind of lived experiences of digital piracy would have, I think, provided a lot more insight than what this person actually did. But also, I mean, again, I'm making some inferences about the kinds of things you guys are looking for, but I would assume sort of originality and creativity are a huge part of it in all fields. And so that, looks very different in something like, fiction writing versus physics. But in all cases, it's a new thing. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this person could have asked a new question, like, what are people's motivations for engaging in this behavior? Not totally clear to me how new that is, but an argument could be made that that's new, and then have done something with that. As it is, it's basically just a summary of how digital streaming works, which is not new. I mean, it's just kind of a technical explanation. It's more like like a pamphlet about digital streaming than it is a unique or individual work. Yeah. So to me, this, if I was in the position of making a decision here, this does not feel salvageable to me. It feels like this person could do a different thing on the same topic and it could be good. This work, I think, is not salvageable by my opinion. Other thoughts on this one, or questions as to why I'm being so mean to this person?
No, I agree with you and would probably be even worse about it.
Fair. I might be, my comments off to the side might have a lot of yikes in them, so yeah, my reaction was not entirely positive. Okay.
Could you show us some
Yeah.
of your work?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Sure.
I mean, I don't want to impose.
No, not at all. So what would be, in what sense?
Maybe a paper that you recommend that is has some credence to it that
Yeah.
we could analyze, and then
Yeah,
and you
sure.
can point out areas, even though I'm guessing it'll be a lot more subtler than the egregious errors that we see here.
Sure, sure.
But the subtler things of areas to focus on, things to
Mhm.
look out for, while getting a sense of
Yeah.
which is a good paper and which is not.
Yeah, I sure can. I mean, I don't know if there's a sort of easy way to do that right now, but I could certainly send that along after I leave and then give some feedback. So there's a couple things I could do. I mean, I could send. I'll think about that, because I mean the obvious things that I have easily accessible that are my own to send would be like published papers, which have gone through the rigor of review already, and so nothing's perfect, but they would have most of the stuff that you'd be looking for would have been caught somewhere in that process.
Right.
It's a long and horrible process when you're publishing in professional journals. So, but certainly that would give you a sense of what something that is publishable would look like, at least in psychology. So I can certainly do that. I can also heavily de-identify and then send along, for example, some things that students of mine have written that may be perfectly fine papers, but not at the level of like a published work. Again, I would be very careful that no one would know whose it is, but I can think I could look back to students who are 10 years ago gone now, and send that along, which might provide a little bit more fodder for reaction, certainly. I mean, the other thing I can do, I mean, we've kind of been doing this, but is just give you a sense of the sorts of questions that I ask myself as I'm reviewing papers, which again typically are in psychology, but pretty broadly defined. So, I think that, apologies already if I'm going to repeat myself, because some of this has really come up a lot in the ones we've been looking at so far, but when I'm reviewing papers, there's always stuff you can nitpick. I mean, there's always sentences that are not as well written as you'd like them to be. There's always room for greater, more in-depth background or less in-depth background sometimes. But the kinds of things that I think end up for me making or breaking a paper's potential, because I think that's where the hard decision comes in, is is this even something we want to give this student a chance to revise? I assume that's part of the process, probably. Are just really a few things, and that is, one, is it a reasonably original and interesting idea? Those are actually two really different questions. You can have something that's super original and just not interesting, and given that, the number of pages you guys have to put stuff in is very limited, it kind of has to be both, probably. It's going to be competing with a lot of other great work. So it should be something that, a majority of you, let's say, are kind of like, I enjoyed reading this. This was actually cool to learn about. And again, also that makes some reasonable argument that it's new in some way. And in the world of science, new is not always like brand new, but something, a new angle on something. So that's, the kind of conceptual question. And then in terms of the methodology, again, there may be no one in this room who's a perfect expert for exactly the kind of paper that comes in. But, there shouldn't be anything glaring. Like if something makes you go, what? They did what? Or wait, why did they do that? That's probably not a good sign. And so, for me, I'm usually working well within my comfort zone, so I can be a little bit more specific about the methods that I would like to see. But, if you feel like they should, if it's a social science paper, if there's something that you feel like they should have measured and they don't say that they measured it, or, they're reporting on an experiment and it feels like the way that they did things are just kind of sloppy, I mean, those are things that you can pick up without ever having taken a class even in that field, maybe. So certainly those would be, particularly if it's a study that's been run, I mean, if the methods are flawed, that's unredeemable, but essentially at that point. And then, of course, that the analyses are reasonable, but that may or may not be something that's easy to evaluate if you're not in the field that it's written in. But what you can get from like the discussion section typically, or the kind of whatever concluding sections of a social science paper, is does it seem that the conclusions they're drawing are reasonable based on what they did and what they found? There is an overwhelming temptation for people all the way from undergrad up through senior faculty to overstate our findings. It's just, we wanted to find something, it's probably why we were in the study in the first place. If you get even a hint in your analyses that something looks like it's right. It's attempting to make grand sweeping statements. I saw that a little bit in the intimate partner violence one where, it's a correlation that wasn't really perfectly run, and they're like, this tells us everything we ever need to know about how to fix intimate partner violence. Well, probably not. So, you want to sort of look for appropriateness of conclusions. That's something that can be fixed, of course. If the findings are interesting but the conclusions are overwrought, you can certainly ask the person to tone it down. And again, lack of clarity is a major, major issue when writing, and it's, I think, something you'll see as a problem more than almost anything else, because even if a faculty member has edited and helped out, sometimes we get so in our heads about our topic area that we just forget that other people don't know that jargon or aren't used to hearing this kind of complex way of explaining something. And so lack of clarity is something that even the most well-intended, best-run study can suffer from. And again, that's to me something that is probably redeemable. I mean, if you give the person a chance and it comes back looking as bad or worse the second time, well, maybe it's not redeemable. But I think that if you're just I think there's something here, I'm just not sure because it's sort of not written clearly or it's not justified well, that's the kind of thing that probably on a second run the person could fix. So, messed up methods, bad idea, not original idea, uninteresting idea, probably unredeemable, lack of clarity, overstating conclusions, those are fixable problems typically. So that's kind of the broadest view, I would say, of my reviewing process. Anything else? Yeah. What's up?
It seems like often we have a really hard time, I don't know if selling or pitching is the right word, but we have a really hard time gaining scientific submissions just
Sure, yeah.
because they take so much time, and it
Yeah.
seems like generally when you jump through all these hoops, you generally want to put it in some kind of undergraduate
Research journal. Sure.
Do you have any kind of advice for us as far as marketing wise for that?
I do. Am I correct that this is something that's disseminated all the way across the UC system?
Actually nationwide this year.
Okay, oh, that's right, I should know that, sorry.
That's okay.
That's the thing, because, yay, UCR Research Journal, it's super, super awesome, but no one reads it outside of UCR, so if people want, their work to be seen, you're in a much better position to make that happen for them. And given what I also know about the sort of, high rejection rate is the negative way to put that, competitiveness is a good thing, it's something that, if a student got their paper in here, putting that in their personal statement for grad school or whatever, there's a very strong argument that this is then really competitive work. I actually have sort of a weirdly technical question, but an important one. Do you guys know how the sort of copyright works such that if a person published a paper in Audeamus, could they also publish it then later in a field level academic journal?
I thought they could.
So we don't take first publishing rights or so other
Right.
journals will do that.
Okay,
We
yeah.
don't. So
That's really important. I mean, and that's another thing to probably make really clear to sciencey folks, because I wouldn't say, I think that you can make a very strong argument that it's worth submitting it here, even instead of, but certainly in addition to their campus's research journal. But if people are unclear about whether publishing it here would mean they can't then submit the work to, again, a field level journal, yeah, that's going to be a major hurdle because people will want to probably reserve that right. So if they can do that, and that's, with the campus journal, they can do both. So making that really clear would remove, a faculty member might be like, well, don't publish it there. You want to send it to, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology or whatever. But if you make clear that, that doesn't rule out that possibility, it just gets you an even sort of a different and wider audience. I would expect that, a lot of students are writing papers for other things. So maybe a student doesn't do it just for this, but if they've already written it for a capstone project or for journal submission somewhere else, there's no reason why they shouldn't be sending you their best work. So I think you have a very strong case to make. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions?
I have a thought for Audeamus though. Do we have a revision process? Because that's
yeah.
what I've been wondering, because I'm new.
I was
so.
presuming there was, but that's actually an important question.
Generally, no. We don't
why did everyone just look at me?
Because I'm still learning, so I'm winging it. But generally, no.
Yeah, we don't have because we have such a short publishing time, right? So
yeah.
We receive the pieces, and then generally as editors we correct grammar and try to preserve I guess
poetic
artistic,
license.
Poetic license and those kinds of things. So we'll return the paper and say hey, here's some of our edits. Is there any change? Is there something we might ask for a couple of things? I don't remember in the past if I've asked anything really specific, but we might say hey, was this your original intention, or is there something missing that you could add or something? Like,
Mhm.
but it's very short turnaround time, because like generally it's like, here's most of what our editors have thought we should change about the grammar or whatever, and like, by this date, please let us know, and then
Mhm.
otherwise it'll be published in this form.
But as far as
So it's
like major edits, we don't.
Yeah,
Okay.
because if it needs like
Yeah.
extensive revision,
We don't have
it's
time.
something.
There's no
you
time,
can't,
yeah,
like,
sure.
fix.
Well, I mean, that, you know, that's totally fine, I'm sure. Well, you know, assuming you're getting as good of and as many submissions as you want, then that just means they better get it right the first time. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It changes my advice only in the sense of, is it redeemable, stops being a consideration. Essentially, it just needs to be, is it good already, good enough already? You know, and if they've really worked on it right and had their PI, you know, involved enough to, again, not rewrite, but edit it into good shape, then there should be no reason why it's not at least halfway decent when you get it. So, yeah, but that's a good question, because again, it's typical in sort of scientific publishing practices that there is an opportunity often to say, like, clarify this, change this, could you make this clearer? Yeah. I hope this was helpful. I wasn't sure what would be most useful. And can I ask, actually, has it always been the case that I'm not looking at this corner of the room, anybody, that these kinds of papers were an option? I mean, I certainly think of Audeamus as being more of a sort of creative outlet. Is it newer that like science papers can be in there?
The newest is video and media, but we've
Right.
always done like pretty much anything reproducible on paper.
Okay, oh, that's right, yeah.
So like research, scientific research.
So maybe that message may not be getting out as much, or hadn't been getting out as much.
I think it's just, it comes down to like, as far as when we were at the conference this weekend and we're trying to market people with science stuff, it's like
Yeah.
organic chemistry that people don't really know, or it's something like,
Right.
oh, I've worked for this my entire college career and I don't know if I want to publish it here, and so
Right.
I think it's going to come down to working on our marketing techniques,
Mhm.
because I think it's different when you're talking to people about poetry and creative writing.
Yeah, they're very different kinds of endeavors.
Yeah, there's a different kind of time commitment, I think, when it comes to a lot of, I mean, not necessarily, but in a lot of like scientific
Right.
papers, it's a long term.
Well, and that's why I asked that weirdly technical question about copyright, because, you know, if a student says that, you say, but great, you can publish it here and somewhere. You know, there's no reason not to also publish it here, if that's true. Yeah, because I mean, that would be a major hurdle for sure, but if that doesn't, as you say, sort of take away publishing rights elsewhere, then that shouldn't be a barrier. I mean, something to consider, forgive me for sort of providing unsolicited advice here, but, you know, again, given the audience and given how incredibly broad the audience is, it may be worth giving some thought, maybe not this year, but in subsequent years, to narrowing the sort of and length of and sort of format of scientific papers that you'd want to solicit. Because it strikes me that maybe the very best kind of scientific papers you'd want would be ones that, you know, are really written for a lay audience, meaning non-experts. And that's not, I mean, you saw from that intimate partner violence, I mean, the typical way you're going to write a scientific piece the audience is really not meant to be everyone. It's meant to be people in that field. But you can write a paper that is meant, so like, for example, I've occasionally written papers for, or pieces, you might say, for like magazines or like the Chronicle of Higher Education review magazine, where I'm, you know, describing a study, but I'm not like putting all the statistics in there, and it's not heavy on methods, it's not, you know, in APA or AMA format or whatever. It's just kind of like, here's some background, and here's kind of the story of the study. Like, here's kind of what I was thinking, and when I ran this, and here's kind of the interesting background. And so we ran a study in which we did this kind of stuff, and here's kind of what we found, and then here's kind of what that means. And that might, in the long run, be a better fit for this kind of journal, and it's not as heavy of an endeavor then for a student to put something like that together. So again, it may be too late for this year, but just that's a very different kind of solicitation than to say, like, send us your typical sciencey, you know, papers. Sorry, again, I'm just like randomly pitching to the side of the room, but that is just a thought. I don't know. I mean, you know, obviously it's something you guys will need to decide, but just something to consider, because I think that can be, and I can actually send along some examples of that too, or one or two. And it's rarer that we write like that, but it's also something that, frankly, can be a really good experience for a student to do, because especially in the social sciences, and really in any sciences, you know, you're often asked by the media to talk to them, to sort of summarize your work for them, and so it's a really important skill as a scientist to know how to present your work in a way that could end up in, like, you know, the UCR magazine or something like that, where it's not heavily technical, but you need to be able to convey clearly and accurately what you did and what you found. So just something to think about, that might be, it might be helpful to convey to students, like that's a really good way of submitting your scientific work here. So just a thought. Okay. Shall I leave you all alone now? All right, well, thank you. I enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful. Again, feel free to follow up on Kate Sweeney. If you have questions that just didn't occur to you while you're sitting here, I'm happy to answer them over email, and I'll try to remember, or someone can remind me to send, maybe I'll send it to Greg, and then he can disseminate things that I mentioned I would send.
That would be awesome. Thank you so